To address the threat of antibiotic resistance, we need a multifaceted approach. According to the CDC, about half of all antibiotics Americans take are used inappropriately. Ramanan, the first question is for you. Why is this happening? What are we doing about it? And what more do we need to do?
Thanks, Diane. I'd like to start with a short video that gives you a sense for how bad resistance is. So this is resistance to Acinetobacter, carbapenem resistance. And carbapenem is sort of the last line of defense against these gram-negative infections. And you can see as the years go by, most of the states, the census regions, are turning red, orange. We started with less than 10% resistance. And by the time you get to 2012, you see that most of the country is blanketed with the orange or red zone, which is above 60%, in some cases 40 to 60%. This is a truly worrisome scenario because this means that there's a significant chance that if one were to get this infection going into a hospital, that the drugs would not work. And one thing is true, just like death and taxes, going into a hospital is pretty much a given for nearly all of us. And getting an infection is a possibility at some point when in a hospital. Antibiotics are truly amazing drugs because they treat infectious diseases, bacterial infections, but they're also different from other drugs. If I were to take a statin, that doesn't diminish the effectiveness of the statin for any of you. On the other hand, if I were to take an antibiotic, whether appropriately or inappropriately, the selection pressure that is placed on bacteria to then evolve towards being more resistant then has an effect on everyone else, which means that you could get an infection that was drug resistant even if you had never actually abused antibiotics or overused antibiotics or even used antibiotics in the past. Now, to be sure, antibiotics are important drugs. They save lives, and that's the reason why we use them. But as Diane mentioned, the CDC estimates that about 50% of antibiotics that are consumed inappropriately. In fact, we published a study with CDC just a few months ago in The Lancet, which showed that in about a third of patients who were put on antibiotics in 6 premier facilities in the United States, a third of them had no indication for getting an antibiotic. No abnormal white blood count, no fever, nothing that someone reviewing their charts would say they needed an antibiotic. About half of them didn't even get a blood culture to see if they had an infection. And in about a third of these patients who had a negative culture, they were still kept on the antibiotics regardless. So we have a significant problem, which is really a societal problem. It's a problem of a shared global commons because what we do affects not just us, but people outside the room, but also people in other countries, and also the shared bacteria between the animal sector and the human sector, which means that we're just hosts for these bacteria to hop around, and all of the inappropriate use, which comes from the lack of incentives that each of us has to really do the right thing, in the same way that we don't really pay that much attention to climate change when we decided to fly out here or take a car or whatever, because we think our impact on that is really so small. It's really the same thing with drug resistance, and we underestimate the impact that all of us collectively have on the problem.